I never saw my feminization coming. And I mean that literally. There was no single moment, no dramatic mirror scene, no whispered confession under a childhood blanket that made me realize something inside me was different. It happened the way real change usually happens in a person's life. Slowly, quietly, in fragments so small that by the time I looked back and tried to gather them into something meaningful, I was already someone I hadn't planned on becoming. And if you're here listening to this, I want you to know from the start that this isn't a story about spectacle. It isn't a story about shock. It's a story about a person, an ordinary one, who spent years trying to understand himself and eventually had to admit that the picture he'd been drawing of his own life wasn't quite finished. Dear friends, your one click can make a big difference. Subscribe now and help us bring you more amazing content every week. My name doesn't matter as much as the story does, so I'll just say that I grew up in a small town in the middle of the country, the kind of place where everyone knew everyone, where church bells rang on Sunday mornings whether you went inside or not, and where the boys were expected to be boys in a very specific kind of way. My father worked at a machine shop. My mother taught 4th grade. I had a younger sister who idolized me for reasons I never fully understood, because I never felt as strong or as certain as she seemed to think I was. From the outside, my childhood was uncomplicated. I played baseball because my father wanted me to. I joined the Cub Scouts because that's what the boys on my street did. I mowed the lawn on Saturdays, I passed my classes, I made a few friends, I lost a few, I skinned my knees, I broke my arm falling off a bike when I was 9. In every way that mattered on paper, I was a normal American boy growing up in a normal American town. But there was something quieter happening underneath. Something I couldn't have named at the time, even if I'd wanted to. I remember being maybe 6 or 7, standing in my mother's closet while she was folding laundry in the other room, and looking at her dresses hanging in a row, and feeling something I couldn't explain. It wasn't envy exactly. It wasn't longing in the way an adult understands longing. It was more like recognition. Like looking at a photograph of a place you've never been, and somehow knowing the smell of the air there. I didn't touch anything. I didn't try anything on. I just stood there for a long moment, and then my mother called my name, and I went back to whatever a 6-year-old goes back to, and I forgot about it. Or I thought I did. Looking back now, I think that was the first flicker of the thing that would eventually shape so much of my inner life. But at the time, I filed it away in the same drawer where a child files every confusing thing, and I moved on. Childhood has a way of handing you contradictions and asking you to carry them without complaint. I carried mine. Elementary school passed without incident. I liked reading more than most of the boys around me, and I hid that when I could, because being called a bookworm was the softest of many possible insults, and softness was not something a boy in my town was supposed to want. I remember once, in 3rd grade, we had a class party where the girls brought in dolls and the boys brought in action figures, and I sat with my G.I. Joe and watched the girls arrange their dolls' hair with a kind of quiet attention that fascinated me. I didn't want their dolls. I didn't want to sit with them. But I wanted, in some way I couldn't articulate, to understand what they were doing. To be included in the softness of it. My teacher noticed me watching, I think, and she smiled the kind of smile adults give when they see something they don't quite know how to interpret, and she moved on. I moved on too. That's what you do when you're a child. You move on, and you carry the small, unresolved feelings with you, and they build up in a place inside you that you don't know exists yet. Middle school was when the pressure started to sharpen. Boys around me began to change. Their voices dropped, their shoulders broadened, their humor turned meaner. There was a kind of policing that started happening, a constant unspoken measurement of masculinity that we all participated in whether we wanted to or not. If you laughed the wrong way, someone noticed. If you sat with your legs crossed at the knee instead of the ankle, someone noticed. If you liked a song that the girls liked, someone noticed. And I noticed too. I noticed myself. I began to watch myself from the outside, correcting my walk, correcting my voice, correcting the tilt of my head, because I had learned, without anyone ever teaching me directly, that there were certain ways of being a boy that were safe, and certain ways that weren't. I passed. I passed easily, actually, because I was good at watching and I was good at adjusting. But the cost of passing is that you spend so much energy on the surface that you forget to check on what's happening underneath. And underneath, something was still there, still waiting, still recognizing. When I was 13, I remember borrowing a book from the school library about world cultures, and there was a chapter on traditional clothing in different countries, and I stared at the photographs of men in robes and long garments, and something in me eased. I didn't know why. I closed the book and returned it, and told no one. That was the pattern, and it would stay the pattern for years. Notice something. Feel something. Tell no one. High school made things harder because high school makes everything harder. My father, who I loved deeply and still love, began to talk to me more about what it meant to be a man. He didn't do it cruelly. He did it the way a father does when he wants his son to be prepared for the world. He talked about responsibility, about providing for a family one day, about not letting people walk over me, about standing up straight and looking people in the eye. And I absorbed all of it because I wanted to be the son he was proud of, and because most of what he said was actually good advice about being a decent human being. But there was an undercurrent to it, too, an assumption about what shape my life would take, and I couldn't tell him that some part of me wasn't sure that shape fit. Because I wasn't sure either. I still didn't have language for it. All I knew was that when I was alone in my room, sometimes I would catch my reflection in the dark window and look at myself and wonder, without any specific plan or wish, what it would be like to be someone else. Not someone famous. Not someone stronger. Just someone different. Someone I hadn't met yet. I dated a girl in my junior year. Her name was Rachel, and she was kind and smart and patient with me in a way I didn't deserve at the time. I liked her genuinely. I liked spending time with her. I liked the way she talked about books, and the way she laughed with her whole face. But I also noticed, and this is something I've only been able to admit to myself much later, that part of what I liked was the way she moved through the world. The way she got to be soft in public. The way she got to wear colors I couldn't wear. The way she got to cry at the end of a movie without anyone thinking less of her. I didn't understand at the time that some of what I thought was attraction was also, in a quieter and more complicated way, something like admiration for a kind of freedom I didn't think I was allowed. We broke up before graduation, not because anything went wrong, but because I was leaving for college in another state, and neither of us wanted to hold the other back. I remember hugging her goodbye in the driveway of her parents' house and feeling grateful and sad and confused all at once. And I didn't know then that I would spend a lot of my 20s trying to figure out what that confusion actually was. College was the first time I lived somewhere no one knew me. And I want to be honest about what that meant because I think a lot of people who go through what I went through will recognize this. When you grow up in a place where everyone has an idea of who you are, you become a kind of performance of yourself. You wake up every morning and put on the version of you that other people expect, and after a while you forget which parts are the costume and which parts are the skin underneath. Leaving that town, moving into a dorm room 3 states away, meeting people who had no prior expectations of me, was like taking off a coat I hadn't realized I was wearing. I didn't do anything dramatic. I didn't reinvent myself overnight. I didn't suddenly start dressing differently or acting differently, but I started to breathe differently. I started to notice my own thoughts without immediately editing them for public consumption. And in that quiet, in that space where no one was watching me the way they used to, the feelings I'd been filing away since I was 6 years old started to unfile themselves. It happened first as curiosity. I would be walking across campus and see a woman in a well-cut coat and think, without any specific plan, that I would like to know what it felt like to wear something like that. Not to look at, not to be near, to wear. And the thought would surprise me, and I would push it away, and it would come back the next week in a slightly different form. I remember the first time I actually acted on any of it. I was 20 years old. I was home alone in my apartment during a long weekend. My roommate was gone. I had done my laundry, and I was folding a scarf that a female friend had left behind after study session, and without really thinking about it, I wrapped it around my neck the way I'd seen her wear it, and I looked in the mirror, and something in my chest did a small, quiet thing that I can only describe as relief. It wasn't excitement. It wasn't a thrill. It was relief. Like a door I hadn't known was closed had opened just a crack, and a little bit of fresh air had come in. I took the scarf off almost immediately. I folded it back up. I put it on the table. I sat down on the couch, and I stared at the wall for a long time. And then I got up and went about my day, and I told no one. The pattern held, but something had shifted, because now I knew. I knew that this thing, whatever it was, wasn't going to stay filed away forever. And I knew that at some point I was going to have to figure out what to do with it. What followed was several years of the most confusing and lonely stretch of my life, and I want to talk about it honestly, because I think a lot of people who go through identity exploration go through something similar, and I think it helps to hear that you're not alone. I graduated. I got a job. I moved to a bigger city for work. I made friends who didn't know my family. I dated occasionally, mostly women, mostly briefly, and I told myself that I was just picky, or just busy, or just not ready for anything serious. What I wasn't telling anyone, including myself most of the time, was that I had started, very slowly and very privately, exploring what it felt like to present differently when I was alone. It wasn't about being seen. It wasn't about performance. It was about a very small, very quiet conversation I was having with myself about who I was when no one was watching. And that conversation was uncomfortable. It was uncomfortable because I had grown up in a world that had given me very specific ideas about what men were supposed to be, and every small experiment I did in the privacy of my own apartment felt like a betrayal of the person my father had raised me to be. I felt guilt. I felt shame. I felt afraid. I felt afraid of being discovered, afraid of being judged, afraid of losing the life I had built, afraid of losing the love of people whose love I depended on. And underneath all of that fear was another fear, one that took me the longest to name, which was the fear that if I let this thing become real, I would lose the version of myself I had spent my whole life constructing. Because the version of myself I had constructed was the version everyone loved. And if that version wasn't the real one, then who was I actually, and would anyone love that person? I want to pause here and say something because I think it matters. I don't believe that everyone who explores their identity in this way ends up in the same place. Some people discover something about themselves that changes their whole life. Some people discover that what they were exploring was one facet of a more complex self, and they integrate it quietly. Some people find that it was a phase, a chapter, a question they needed to ask and then set down. I'm not here to tell you what the right answer is for anyone else. I'm only here to tell you what happened to me and what I learned and what I wish someone had told me when I was in the middle of it. What I wish someone had told me was that it was okay to not know. It was okay to take a long time to figure it out. It was okay to be afraid. And it was okay to ask for help. I didn't ask for help for a long time. I tried to figure it out alone, and I paid a real price for that, and I want to talk about that price honestly, because I think it's important. The price was my mental health. In my late 20s, I started to feel a kind of tiredness that no amount of sleep could fix. I would go to work, do my job well, come home, close the door, and sit in my apartment feeling like I had been holding my breath all day. Because I had been holding my breath since I was 6 years old, since that afternoon in my mother's closet, since every time I noticed something about myself and chose to file it away instead of look at it. And the effort of holding my breath for that long had started to catch up with me. I started to sleep badly. I started to lose interest in things I used to enjoy. I started to feel a distance between myself and the people around me, even the people I loved most, because I knew there was a part of me they didn't know, and I didn't know how to introduce them to it, and I wasn't even sure I knew who that part was myself. I got quiet. I got smaller. I withdrew. And eventually one afternoon, sitting on the floor of my kitchen for no particular reason, I realized that I couldn't keep going the way I had been going. I want to be careful here because I know some people listening might be in a similar place, and I want to say clearly that if you are, please reach out to someone. A therapist, a doctor, a trusted friend, a hotline, anyone. You do not have to carry this alone, and there are people whose entire job is to help you carry it. I was lucky. I had insurance through my job, and I made an appointment with a therapist, and I sat in her office for the first session and cried for most of the hour without being able to say what I was crying about. She was patient. She didn't push. She asked me to come back the next week, and the week after that, and slowly, over months, I started to talk. I talked about my father. I talked about my hometown. I talked about the scarf. I talked about the closet. I talked about all the small moments I had spent years filing away, and as I laid them out on the table between us, I started to see, for the first time, that they formed a pattern, that they had always formed a pattern, and that the pattern was not something wrong with me. It was just something true about me. something I had been carrying my whole life without knowing what it was. My therapist never told me what to conclude. She never labeled me. She never suggested a direction. What she did was help me learn to sit with myself without flinching. She helped me understand that identity is not always a straight line, that many people spend years or decades understanding themselves, that the process of exploration is not the same as the process of decision, and that I was allowed to take my time. She helped me distinguish between what I actually wanted and what I was afraid of wanting. And slowly, very slowly, I started to make peace with the fact that a part of me had always been drawn to a softer, more feminine way of expressing myself. Not as a costume, not as a performance, not as a rejection of who I was, but as an addition to it. A dimension of myself I had been trying to amputate for years, and which had refused to disappear no matter how hard I tried. When I use the word feminization, I use it in a very specific and personal way. For me, it wasn't about becoming someone else. It wasn't about erasing the man I had been raised to be. My father's lessons about responsibility and honesty and standing up straight are still part of me, and I'm grateful for them. What feminization meant for me was permission. Permission to let a part of myself that had always been there come to the surface. Permission to wear a color I liked without asking whether I was allowed to. Permission to move through the world with a little more softness, a little more gentleness, a little more of the quality I had noticed in my mother and my sister and Rachel and every woman who had ever been kind to me. It was not a total rewriting. It was a completion. It was the last piece of a puzzle I hadn't even known I was assembling. But permission, once you give it to yourself, requires you to figure out how to live with it in the world. And that's the part I want to talk about next, because it's the part most people don't talk about honestly. Coming to terms with yourself in the privacy of your own thoughts is one thing. Living in a family, in a community, in a workplace, with the full complexity of who you are, is another. I did not come out with a dramatic announcement. That's not the kind of person I am, and it's not the kind of story mine turned out to be. What I did was tell one person at a time, slowly, at a pace I could survive. The first person I told was my sister. I flew home for her birthday, and after dinner, when our parents had gone to bed, we sat on her back porch with 2 mugs of tea, and I told her that there was something I had been working through, and that I wanted her to know because I was tired of being partly hidden from the person I trusted most in the world. She listened. She didn't interrupt. When I was finished, she took a long, slow sip of her tea, and she said, "I love you." That was the first thing she said. Then she said, "I'm glad you told me." Then she said, "I don't fully understand it yet, but I want to." And then she said, "Thank you for trusting me." And I sat there on her porch, in the dark, with the crickets going, and I felt something loosen in my chest that had been tight since I was 6 years old. She asked me questions over the following weeks. Some of them I had answers to. Some of them I didn't. She never once made me feel like a stranger. She was, and is, the kind of sister a person is lucky to have, and I don't take that for granted. Telling my parents was harder. I want to be honest about that. My mother took it better than I expected. She cried, but not the way I feared. She cried in the way people cry when they're absorbing something and don't want to say the wrong thing. She hugged me. She told me she loved me. She said she needed some time to understand it, and she asked if I would be patient with her, and I said of course. My father was quieter. He didn't say much when I first told him. He looked at his hands for a long time. He asked me a few careful questions. He didn't hug me right away, and I felt that absence acutely, and I want to talk about it because I think fathers and sons often have complicated silences between them, and I don't want to pretend mine was simple. What I learned in the months that followed is that my father was not rejecting me. He was grieving. He was grieving the specific picture he had held in his head of who his son was going to be, and he needed time to let that picture soften and rearrange itself. He didn't stop loving me. He didn't cut me off. He just got quiet for a while. And then slowly he started to come back. He called more often. He asked about my life. He didn't always know the right words, and sometimes he used the wrong ones, but he was trying. And trying, from a man of his generation and background, was more than I had any right to expect. When I visited home a year later, he took me out to the garage where he had always worked on his projects, and he showed me a small wooden box he had built. He said he had made it for me. He said it was for keeping things and that were important. He didn't say what things. He didn't need to. I still have that box. I keep it on my dresser. I don't tell him this often enough, but that box is one of the most important things I own. There have been harder moments too, and I want to include them because I don't want this story to sound like a smooth arc. It hasn't been smooth. There have been friends who couldn't stay friends. There have been coworkers who cooled toward me in ways that were never directly acknowledged, but were clearly felt. There have been strangers on the street who have said things I don't want to repeat. There have been days when I wondered if the effort of being fully myself was worth the cost of being partly rejected. There have been nights when I thought about going back into hiding because hiding, for all its exhaustion, is at least familiar. What kept me from going back was, honestly, the memory of that afternoon on the kitchen floor. The memory of what it had cost me to spend so many years holding my breath. I could not go back to that. Whatever the price of being seen, the price of not being seen had almost broken me. And so I stayed visible in the quiet, careful way that felt right for me. I did not become a public figure. I did not become a spokesperson. I became, more than anything, a fuller version of the person I had always been. I want to talk about the ethical side of this because I think it matters and I don't hear it talked about enough. Exploring who you are is not a license to abandon the responsibilities you have to other people. When I was in the middle of my confusion, I made mistakes. I was not always fully honest with the people I dated. I was not always emotionally available to the friends who needed me. I was so preoccupied with my own inner work that I sometimes forgot that the people around me had inner lives too, and that they deserved my presence, not just the outline of it. I have apologized for some of those mistakes, and there are others I am still trying to make amends for in the small ongoing ways that adult amends usually take. What I've learned is that self-discovery is not an excuse. Being on a journey does not entitle you to leave a trail of harm behind you. You still owe honesty to the people who love you. You still owe kindness to the people you work with. You still owe basic respect to the strangers you pass on the street, even the ones who don't offer it back to you. Growth is not the opposite of responsibility. Growth is a kind of responsibility. And the deepest thing I've learned from all of this is that identity is not a costume you put on to escape yourself. It's a practice you engage in to become more fully yourself, and the measure of whether you're doing it well is not how comfortable you are with yourself, but how well you continue to treat the people around you. I want to say something to the young person listening to this who might be at the beginning of a similar path. I want to say it directly because I wish someone had said it to me. You do not have to have this figured out today. You do not have to give it a name. You do not have to make any big decisions. You do not have to tell anyone until you're ready, and you get to decide when ready means. The feelings you have are not evidence that something is wrong with you. They are just information. They are your inner life trying to tell you something, and your only job right now is to listen without punishing yourself for what you hear. Find someone you trust. If you can't find someone in your life, find a therapist or a support line or a moderated online community with good rules and kind people in it. Do not try to carry this alone the way I tried to carry it alone. It costs too much, and you are worth more than that cost. And to the parent listening, the friend listening, the coworker listening, the person who has someone in their life who might be walking through something like what I walked through, I want to say this. You do not have to understand it perfectly to love someone through it. You do not have to have the right words. You do not have to have any words at all. You just have to stay. Staying is the whole thing. My sister stayed. My mother stayed. My father, in his quiet way, stayed. And staying was what let me become the person I am now. If you can stay, stay. If you're going to leave, leave gently and don't pretend it was ever about anything other than your own limits. Where I am now is not a finish line. I want to be clear about that. I am not a person who has arrived. I am a person who is still becoming, which is what I think we all are, and which I think is what human life actually is. I dress the way I want to dress most days now, which sometimes means one way and sometimes means another, and I have stopped trying to explain the specifics of it to people who don't need explanations. I have a small circle of close friends who know all of me. I have a job I like in a city I've grown fond of, with a routine that mostly suits me. I go home to see my parents twice a year, and it is easier every time. My sister and I talk almost every week. I have not found a romantic partner yet who has stayed for the long term, and I'll be honest and say that has been hard, and I still hope for it. I don't know what my life will look like in 10 years. I don't know what parts of myself I have yet to meet, but I know that whoever I become, I will not hold my breath for that person the way I held my breath for so long. I will let them arrive when they arrive, and I will greet them, and I will make room for them. I want to end with the thing I wish I could go back and tell this 6-year-old standing in his mother's closet. I would tell him that nothing he felt in that moment was wrong. I would tell him that he was not broken, that he was not confused, that he was not ashamed and did not need to be. I would tell him that the recognition he felt looking at those dresses was not a sign that something was the matter with him. It was a very early, very quiet piece of information about who he was going to grow into, and there was no rush to understand it and no reason to be afraid. I would tell him that the people who loved him would love him still, even the ones who would need time, even the ones who would stumble in their love before finding their footing. I would tell him that the world was going to feel very narrow for a very long time, and that he would eventually find a way to widen it, and that the widening would be worth every hard year that came before it. I would tell him to breathe, to just breathe. And then I would step back and let him grow up in his own time, because that's what I finally learned to do for myself. I never saw my feminization coming. But looking back now, from where I stand, I can see that it had been coming for a very long time, in small, quiet ways I didn't have the language to notice. It was not a rupture. It was a completion. It was the last few pages of a book I had been writing without realizing I was the author. And when I look at that book now, I don't see a story of loss. I see a story of a person who spent a long time being afraid of himself and who eventually, slowly, imperfectly, learned to be at home in his own life. That, more than anything, is what I hope you take from this. Not that you should follow the same path I followed. Not that you should reach the same conclusions I reached. But that whoever you are and whatever quiet questions you carry, you deserve to give yourself the time and the kindness to sit with them honestly. You deserve to be at home in your own life. And the road to that home, however long it takes, is worth walking. Thank you for watching and spending this time with me. If this story helped you understand yourself or others a little better, feel free to explore more on the channel.